Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to everyone at the meeting and on the call, and to anyone listening in on the live stream. It's a meeting of the Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee on the 12th of November 2025, and we have no apologies for today. All the committee members are in attendance, and I have no declarations of interest having been notified in advance, but if we could just please confirm that for the record. Nope, no declarations of interest. Thank you very much. Item 1.3 on our agenda today is the minute of the meeting held on the 14th of August for approval. And that, I think, is quite straightforward, but can I have a confirmation that we're happy that's an accurate record of the meeting? Okay, thank you very much. And then we have the action log from that meeting. There are 3 actions all proposed for closure. Members content to note that? Thank you. And then finally, a decision on taking business in private. If members are comfortable then, in accordance with their standing orders, we would take items 5 to 8 in private. Everyone happy with that? Thank you very much. So if I do get thrown off the call, as Chair Katharina has agreed to step in my until I can get back on, but hopefully we won't have any technical issues today. So, moving to the first substantive item on our agenda is item 2.1, an internal audit update. And we have Claire with us today from BDO, so I'm passing over to you, Claire.
Thank you. So the progress update indicates that the plan is progressing really well. There's three final reports to discuss today, and all our key performance indicators are on track. One thing to flag is that management have requested that we defer the audit on communications and engagement, as Police Scotland are in the process of working with consultants to implement new approaches in this area. We agree with the rationale and intend to work with management to assess whether another audit should be brought forward in its place. And we'll kind of keep you updated on our thoughts on that. But that was a notification for your approval to remove that from the plan for now. We've also followed up on 48 recommendations this quarter. We were able to close 18 of those, and 29 are still in the process of being implemented. A further one was not started. And as you've become used to, we've provided the Power BI dashboard, so you're able to see in more detail any that you're particularly interested in.
Yep. Thank you very much, Claire. I have to say the Power BI report is really helpful and really informative, so thank you for that. Before I ask members of the committee if they're happy to defer the communications and engagement audit, can I just ask if there is any progress in terms of considering an alternative audit for this, or whether there will be a replacement audit indeed?
We haven't yet agreed any replacement audit, but we'll keep it under review.
Okay, so are members content to defer the communications and engagement audit to a later stage, and we'll hear back from Claire as to whether or not there is going to be an alternative audit put in place of that? Everyone content to do that? Okay, thank you very much. Right, so if there are any questions on the report itself, any comments, any questions? Pauline.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the report. Really helpful as always. I just wanted to ask about the follow-up of the high-graded recommendations, Claire. There's quite a lot of these that relate back several years. I think the earliest is from year 21-22, and the report says that they aren't due for implementation this quarter. I wasn't quite sure what that meant, given that they are so old. And if these recommendations then are still relevant in that the risk is still material enough, how are Police Scotland managing that risk to an acceptable level in the interim, whilst the more longer term work to fully address the recommendation is being progressed?
So At the last meeting, we presented a report on the implementation of recommendations, and we keep these kind of under review. There are some recommendations where the timescales for implementation shift for sort of operational reasons, but I think the ones that we've noted here as not due for implementation this quarter are potentially ones from like the newest reports. That's my reading of it, but let me double check that. I think I see where that's written on kind of page 7, and I think that's what that means. We're noting that the number of high-rated recommendations has increased, but we weren't expecting them to be implemented this quarter because they're new.
Pauline, content with that?
I don't quite understand it. I think Donna's got her hand up. I'm
sorry,
not sure
Donna.
she's able to
Yes.
clarify.
I'm sorry, I can't get my camera to come on today. I do have it on, so apologies for that. I think I can give some comment on that. I think when we have revised the date, that date then might be into the future and they weren't due in this particular quarter. Within my report, I provide an appendix with all the high risk internal audit recommendations. So I could tell you the ones that it relates to. There's ICT service delivery recommendations, which are the oldest, and they're included today for closure. There's a vetting recommendation in relation to designated posts. There's one in relation to cybersecurity that we'll be putting forward for closure in the next quarter. And there's also a couple relating to compliance of PAVA, and we've done extensive work to minimise the risk whilst we make bigger, longer term improvements. So I think within my report, that's where you might be able to see what actions we're taking to minimise the risk in the meantime.
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, that helps clarify. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? The number of reports that are or recommendations rather that are still in the process of being implemented, 60%. Do we think there is any issue around these at this stage, or is that what was expected? You know, we're missing deadlines quite a lot, so just anxious to know that these deadlines are realistic.
I guess we're still finding that there's a bit of a backlog of recommendations to be implemented and that progress is slower than we'd ideally like, but it is improving. So we have noted that there was more recommendations closed this quarter compared to the previous quarter, and hopefully that trend will continue.
Okay, thank you. Angela, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I did, but I think some of those points I might cover in my report, but I wasn't quite sure if the question was directed at BDO or to Police Scotland, so I was just ready to answer if that was the case. However, I think I might be able to pick up on some of those points through the update I'm about to provide.
Yes, I think so. I think we can pick it up there. So if there's nothing else on item 2.1, nope. Then moving on to the next item, 2.2, Police Scotland Audit and Improvement Recommendation Tracker for Q2. And I think we have, is that yourself, Angela?
It is, yes. Chair, yes.
It is, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So first I would like to update you on the work that's been conducted since last report. We have been carrying out a comprehensive review on the whole system for engaging with scrutiny bodies from initial planning through to the discharge of recommendations. This work is allowing us to redesign our engagement process to ensure we are involved in all the key stages wherever feasible. Page 9 of the report, Appendix A, does provide a summary of all the improvements that we are making across this process. As part of that review, we have carried out a comprehensive review on all recommendations, with a particular focus on those that have been open for 2 years or more. As of December 2025, that will represent 114 recommendations. Each of these have been assessed in terms of the stage they're at, the dependencies, along with alignment to business strategy and risk. From this, we identified 37 that could be closed because circumstances have changed, because they're very advanced, although not yet finalised, but there is strong governance around delivery or they are 80% complete, and that they minimise the risk rather than completely mitigate it. These now need to go through escalation routes through both SPA colleagues and BDO before final decisions are made, and therefore it will take time before we do realise any impact. This can't happen in isolation, and our audit bodies will need to work with us proactively to engage in order for to successfully progress with these closures. Our recording systems, as you're aware with 4Action, ensures that no recommendation is closed without full rationale, a clear audit trail, and a full explanation of any recording of any residual risk. In terms of recency, the recent review also highlighted that although there is a high volume of recommendations, 60% of these have been added since April 2024. We know from an ongoing analysis that it takes between 1 to 2 years to implement and fully engage and evidence a change. Therefore, we don't consider any recommendation made that was within that 2-year period to be classed as a backlog. There is continuous workload associated with recommendations, and Police Scotland is subject to at least 25 audits / inspections annually, averaging 10 recommendations per publication. Recent internal audit recommendations, the last 4 had 20 plus recommendations within each publication. However, only 20% of those were high risk. One of the ones, a significant number, with health and safety, which we had actually asked to be part of the review. In terms of timeframes, one area that we have been trying to strengthen is our ability to estimate realistic timeframes for delivery. We have seen some recommendations experience early delays, and this is often due to well-intentioned but rapid turnaround in terms of improvement plans without potentially fully considering all the steps that are needed to be taken and the wider organisational dependencies. With a steady inflow of recommendations and other work priorities, a degree of reprioritisation needs to be accepted. Despite these challenges, our performance remains strong. Our review highlighted favourable performance against an overall service agreement to address within a timeframe. We are achieving 79% of internal audit recommendations within a year, 69% of HMICS within 2 years. We consider this to be reflective of performance, and therefore we're shifting our focus of reporting. It also means our escalation procedures become more effective, as there are lower numbers to provide a more targeted intervention rather than automatically escalating newer ones. This is performance that we believe reflects well on the organisation's responsiveness and commitment to improvement. In terms of prioritisation, we have a prioritisation matrix which evaluates recommendations based on their opportunity and risk and versus time, cost and effort. We are currently trialling this with an HMICS publication and will report back. Once evaluated, we will intend to embed this as routine and part of our processes. Finally, on internal governance, we have strengthened our focus on the timely management of recommendations and clarified the consequences of delays. We have refreshed escalation procedures in line with BDO's recommendation, which is already improving visibility and accountability. We are looking at group decisions for prioritisation and improvement planning, and have limited our. This has been limited, though, unfortunately, due to the lack of new HMICS publications to test it on. Overall, I would like to assure the committee that we have a strong grip on the end-to-end process from reviewing, engagement, planning and through to delivery and closure, with stronger governance and prioritisation mean that we are well positioned to sustain evidence of ongoing improvement. I'm happy to take any specific questions on the review. However, I want to hand over to Donna, the Audit Manager, who can take you through the more detailed aspects of the report.
Thank you very much, Angela. Donna, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, so it was really just to go through the specific detail of the report. So at the time of producing the report, we had 274 open, and that was covering 54 publications, and that spread right across Police Scotland. And I think you can see on page 7 of Appendix A the sort of breadth and number of recommendations falling into each business area. Almost a third of the publications have only 1 or 2 recommendations remaining open, and these tend to be the last few of that publication and the ones that are more tricky and difficult to address. During the time frame, we had 41 new recommendations that were added, and we closed 48. So as Angela explained, we're perhaps not so good at achieving on this target that we're setting, but there's a range of reasons why that target date sometimes needs to change. So we're looking at changing the way that we report closures, and we're going to give you a better understanding of the progress that we're making towards closure and completion by setting some standards. So we're going to make a commitment to address recommendations within a specific time frame. That's not to say that we won't still monitor against the target date, because we absolutely will. We'll do that alongside it, but I think it gives a much better indication of progress. If we added some recommendations around productions in May, and we're already starting to see them moving dates already, because we've started to look into the work that's required, and we're realizing that we can make a bigger change, or we need it has other dependencies, and that maybe wasn't evident at the time, or we were doing it too quickly to be able to fully impact assess all of that information. So we think by reporting against these two targets, it will give you a better indication of how well we're progressing or not, may the case be. And within Appendix B, I have shown all of those recommendations that are over 2 years old. Now, I would say that's the backlog. And when we produced this report, there were 52 recommendations that were 2 years old at the point of pulling the data off the report. That number will obviously fluctuate on a daily basis as we add more to the system, and we are always closing recommendations as well. And I think when I provided the explanations within Appendix B, I've categorised them into different categories. Requires investment, requires technology, partnership working has been added on as part of a bigger transformation, or quite simply just we don't have the capacity, we've had to reprioritise these, or we've got resourcing difficulties that's meant it's been slower to implement than we might have liked. But we consider that we're making slow and steady progress towards that improvement rather than not making the improvement at all. So whether, I think we will always have those challenges, whether we have 100 recommendations, 200, 300. And just in a question that was asked earlier about, there are a number of internal audit recommendations, and that makes up the majority of the recommendations. And I looked in the system today, we've got 171 internal audit recommendations. And when I looked at the date ranges for those, there were 150 of them that had been added between the 1st of January and today's date. So obviously some of those 150 will have been closed, because we have closed some of those. So I don't think it's an accurate reflection to say that there is a huge backlog. There is a heavy workload, and we do need to be better at prioritising what we can do now, what we will have to put to the side and do when time permits. And that is very true, and that's what we're focusing on. But I don't think it's accurate to say that there is a backlog. There's a workload, and there are some that are taking longer than others. And I've tried to show that within Appendix B and give visibility to those so you can apply your focus to those. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you, Donna. I think the information from Angela and yourself that you've added to the report is helpful and gives us an overview of the situation. And I do think we absolutely understand the workload that these recommendations represent. So we're not underestimating that in any way. But it is helpful, and I think it's also particularly helpful to see that when you're talking about closures, you're giving us evidence of impact, because that's what we're looking for. We're not just want things closed off and think, well, that's it, job done. What we're interested in is, so what if you did the work required to close off the recommendation, what was the impact of that? What was the benefit of it? So that's a helpful additional element of this report. So thank you for that. Now, passing over to members of the committee for any comments or questions. Angela, and then Katharina.
Thanks. Thanks everybody, and thanks to Donna and Donna, that was really helpful. A couple of questions on the report. So the page 7 that you referred to, Donna, was really helpful just to see where the spread of the recommendations sat. I'm just wondering the process for looking at the dependencies between them, because I'm assuming that there'll be some of these recommendations for, say, criminal justice that are also applicable to health and safety and so on. So I'm just interested in how you manage those overlaps and how you make sure that things are progressing and people are playing their part, the different teams are playing their part. And linked to that, there's quite a few when we come on to others, particularly the high risk, that really sit with teams, and given the size of the organisation, you know, embedding change and having change led and managed by teams, as we all know, is really, really important so that it sticks, it's owned by them, and they make it happen. So when you mention capacity, I'm just wondering whether or not there is that acceptance that these recommendations are not for somebody else to be implementing, but they are actually for the teams themselves, potentially with support from others where that's appropriate, to then take the lead on it and to really drive it forward. I've got a few others, but I'll let others in first. My last one, though, is on the hate crime. I think it's page 12. And I just wasn't really sure what that meant, to be honest. So I just wondered if you could expand on why that was delayed and what it really meant, including it into the vision with a milestone date of March. Back to Mary's point about what will we see that will be different then in March 26. Thank you.
Okay, are you happy for me to come in?
Yes,
Will I do
thank
those
you.
in? I'll maybe do them in reverse if that's okay, just in relation to that hate crime one. So this has been one of our long-standing recommendations that we've had, and it requires that recommendation is actually for Police Scotland to expedite discussions with Scottish Government to progress a review of third-party reporting. So it's not actually entirely within the gift of Police Scotland to deliver that. And there is some wider service design work that is going on within government to redesign what that third-party reporting looks like. So Police Scotland is very much a participant of that programme of work, but we're not fully in charge of delivering it. And when I've said there that it's included within as a milestone within our vision and business plan, so we've actually recorded that as an action for delivery within by the end of March 2026. And what we'll be expecting to see is that review of third-party reporting will have been concluded and there will be something to implement going forward. Does that answer that question? In relation to the capacity, so yes, I think there is an acceptance that sometimes the changes are small and they need to be delivered by those particular teams, and the majority of the changes that are set out within these recommendations are being undertaken alongside business as usual activities. So that's why sometimes things get reprioritized, because actually there's the vetting recommendation. That was a classic example. We had to put additional new improvement work to the side because the demands to make sure that we were vetting new recruits and we had a steady stream of people coming into the organisation ready to be deployed was the priority at that point in time. We do have the opportunity within Angela's wider team. There are business areas that can lend support, and my team in particular, if we see that there's an opportunity that another corporate team can go in and support, so we've got the business assurance team, there's the continuous improvement team, can also go in and lend some support to push forward some of the improvements. We take every opportunity that we can in order to do that. But sometimes you do need to have that specialist knowledge of the subject and you're working on it on a day-to-day basis to be able to design and make the changes, and especially make the changes that last. happy for me to move on to
Yeah.
the first point about the dependencies. So I think we're probably better at documenting the dependencies for our HMICS recommendations because we have a longer period of time that we dedicate to improvement planning. So we have a commitment to reply to HMICS within 3 months with an improvement plan. And as part of that process, we're documenting the dependencies. So within internal audit, we're maybe not so good at it, but we recognise that. And I have a team member now working on internal audit, and that's an area that we're going to focus on. We're going to look at all the things that get in the way of implementing this so that we can apply better timescales, more realistic target dates to it, and we know all the things that could potentially get in the way of doing that. So I think that is something that we're getting better at, and we have the opportunity to record that within our 4-action system. So I think that's maybe a bit of a work in progress. That okay?
Yeah, Angela, are you happy with that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just one point, I do think it's really important that all employees, particularly line managers and above, fully understand that it's a fundamental part of their job to be continually improving what they're doing and taking these recommendations on board, notwithstanding that there will be times where they need the support or resources in other areas. So I think that would help with a whole lot, just from a quick scan of some of them, but thank you.
Now, I was going to come back to Katharina, but DCC Smith, you've got your hand up. Is it on this point? Did you want to come in now?
It is, Chair, if that's okay.
Of
It was
course.
just to reassure the committee, and to Angela's point specifically, I've asked Breeder to look at the recommendations that are outstanding. Some of those relate to sort of digital and data in terms of technology enablers, etc. So I've asked Breeder to have a look at how do we incorporate the recommendations that we've got organisationally into the sort of change and transformation plan and function, so that where we've got business areas who are carrying out small changes as per the recommendations, that we can support that from I would call a tier 3 change perspective within my team, so that they can offer some support and guidance as to how the best way to do that. And to Angela's well-made point around landing that change as opposed to just rolling out a piece of kit or tech, if that makes sense. So it's just something that's relatively new in terms of how we do that and building that through the change transformation function. But just to reassure you that we're doing that, it's a work in progress at the moment, and hopefully we'll get better at being able to build those into the long-term plan across the organisation. So just to give you a bit of context around that.
Okay, thank you very much, Bex. So, Katharina.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Angela and Donna. I thought your voiceover over the report was incredibly helpful. I think it did answer some of my questions, so thank you for doing that. I was particularly interested in the improvements that you've outlined on page 9 of your report, and again, you went into a bit more detail on that, so which I think is good. My substantive question actually was very similar to that of Angela's first question, just sort of slightly broader as well. So again, that's been largely answered, I think. I suppose where what was reassuring for me to hear is that from an internal audit perspective, you are thinking of how you can better support that, the improvement planning. So because it is, naturally, what you've outlined is that some of the delays are due to the complexities. Angela obviously touched on the interdependencies in her question, and for me, it's a broader element as well. It's that how robust is the process for the development of management responses to recommendations. So dependencies are obviously one element of that. Timescales is another element. I think what Bex just mentioned, just the organizational wide change and the interdependencies, the connections there. So, whilst I really, I welcome the improvements which you outlined on slide 9, which is all around the management of recommendations. I think you've quite rightly identified that actually the management of recommendations is just one element of it, and it's the management of that improvement planning and the management of management responses to the recommendations. Whatever support you can give is just as essential as well, and that almost kind of, if you get that right, I think the management of everything else that follows on from that should be much easier. So I think overall, as I say, I really welcome this. I think the update is really quite helpful, and it does give me confidence that the organisation has taken the issues which have been identified in the space, which we've discussed in previous committees, quite seriously. So yeah, I'm pleased so far with the progress, and certainly from my perspective, the information that is in front of us is substantially improved, and it gives a clearer picture as to, I think, where you are. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's really a question, as I said, because I think most of my questions have been answered, but just that plea for, yeah, but if you tighten up at the upstream, which is that the improvement planning, the management actions, everything else should really be much easier.
Thank you. Thanks, Katharina. John, I see you've got your hand up.
Morning, Chair. Morning, members.
Morning.
If it's okay, I'd add just a couple of brief comments to those provided by DCC Smith and also by Angela. I think Angela's right to highlight at the start the responsibility on the audit and inspection bodies, and you may recall that I highlighted that a couple of meetings ago. I think we should play a more active role in engaging with the strategic leads, because the recommendations were of their time, some of them 2 or 3 years ago, and picking up DCC Smith's point, things have moved on quite considerably, not just in Police Scotland, but SPA and Forensic Services, and I think SPA and Forensic Services also deserve credit for the work that they've done in this space in managing recommendations. I know that the part that was mentioned about continuous improvement, Police Scotland, SPA and Forensics are making really good inroads in that space, and I think from the committee's point of view, you'll be able to see that longitudinal change coming through. Just briefly on the time for recommendations, I think that if scrutiny bodies are making more strategic focused recommendations, they should take longer, and it's just building it into that transformation programme. So it's just to add some additional assurance to that you've already received, that from an HMI point of view and through the Scottish Public Sector Network, which Craig co-chairs, that's something that's certainly on the radar, and we do and will continue to work with the strategic leads to try and get those positive outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's really helpful, and I think we're all agreed that the most interesting bit of this report, I think, is the improvement plan. So we're able to see, exactly what it is you're planning to do, so that we have, we're able to point to the improvements that have arisen from the inspections and the audits. And that's really helpful. That's, I think, what we'd like to see, rather than always focusing on what was the reason for the delay with this or why have we not done that. We're able to see from the improvement plans on each of these areas some real progress. So on the particular issue of the improvement plan in this report, I wondered when we would be perhaps given a report back on progress to this committee. Would that be would that be at every meeting there will be an update, or is that going to be built into your reporting?
I think if you'd like me to answer.
Yes, thanks, Dora.
I think the intention is that you'll start to see incremental changes. So we'll be doing it at every report. So we've already got the 37 that Angela explained. We've already got procedures underway to try and bring those to a close, but it requires some consultation and negotiation with the scrutiny bodies. So we've already started that. So we'll start to see that coming through at the next meeting. So we'll be able to give an update on where we are, what we've introduced, how effective it's been at every meeting, rather than there will be one big bang and all of the recommendations will have been addressed.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any other comments or questions they want to bring forward at this stage? If not, I think we'll look forward to that regular reporting. Donna, thank you for that. And thank you for all the contributions to this discussion. So we're ready to move on, I think, to item 2.3, which is the SPA Audit and Improvement Recommendation Update. I'm very much mindful of John's comments about the work done by the SPA and forensics as well in this area. So passing over to Graham. Yep.
Good morning, thank you, Chair.
Morning,
Just
Graham.
like to highlight a few points from the paper this morning. So first of all, from the corporate strategy, we have achieved 72% of the milestones expected to be delivered in this quarter. As is normal practice, a review of the milestones to be delivered over the remainder of the year is being conducted to ensure appropriate prioritisation, taking cognizance of resources available. Primarily, the expectation is milestones will be delivered in the remaining quarters of the year to come. Moving on to recommendations, continued progress. We now have 10 open recommendations, with 3 being closed, 2 in respect to HMICS and 1 from internal audit. The third matter I'd just like to highlight in the paper relates to disputed recommendations. There was a process outlined to the RAC in November last year where recommendations, if they're disputed, the process then included update on recommendations that needed further work. 2 of those recommendations have been reviewed again, and we've been engaging between ourselves and SPA Corporate and Digital Division and Police Scotland. And reviewing those 2 recommendations, we put evidence to the accountable officer, who has approved closure of those 2 recommendations based on the work that's been done by Digital Division to address the risk originally identified in the recommendations. Those 2 are not shown as closed in reporting from BDO or Police Scotland just due to timing, but they will be obviously updated in Q3. I'll pause there. Happy to take questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. I was particularly pleased to see the progress that's been made in implementing the new process for disputed recommendations, which is helpful. Now, does anyone have any questions? Paul?
Can I, forgive me if I display my ignorance here, but when an audit is done, do the auditors not usually go back to management before it's published in order to allow them the chance to comment or reflect on the recommendations? Am I incorrect in thinking that?
Yes, I think that would normally be the case, and I think is this with reference to these disputed recommendations?
Yeah, because I'm curious why after all that there's still dispute. You know, yes. It's how much wriggle room do you need after you've been given a chance to comment on it? Yeah. You know, and I get sometimes you can't bring people together, but I'm just curious how bad it has to be for a disputed recommendation to be disputed.
Well, I think that's why we probably had to come up with a new process, because it doesn't happen very often, but we happened to have a couple this time last year. So go back to Graham for an explanation of that, perhaps.
Thank you, Chair. The key point on those 2 recommendations that are now closed is which aligns with the conversation earlier at the committee, is they're 3.5 years old, so things have moved on. Right. And what the key point we tried to do was look back in the original recommendation, what was the risk, and are we now comfortable that that risk has been addressed as far as reasonably possible? And in those 2, that was the conclusion.
So maybe disputed recommendations is maybe not quite, maybe a slight misnomer, but yeah, okay, I get that. The world has moved on and you need to reset. So, right, that's fine. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Paul. That's a helpful question. Clarify that issue. Anyone else with any comments or questions? Chris?
Sorry, Mary, it was just to underscore what Graham was saying there, and just to reassure you and other members that this would only be used in an exceptions basis under the conditions that Graham has kind of set out. So it's not something that we would routinely want to do. That said, I think it kind of aligns with the pragmatism that John outlined that HMICS would be willing to adopt where there are historic recommendations that have been overtaken by circumstances. So, but again, we would only use this where appropriate, I think. And the fact we've only had 2 would support that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. That's helpful. That was my understanding as well. But it's good that, you know, even if it doesn't happen often, we now have a process that we've worked through, and we can show that it works well. Angela.
Sorry to prolong this, just to reinforce that, because I do think that, you know, this is about an improvement agenda, isn't it? And I do think that it's important that if some of the recommendations seem unrealistic or we don't have the capacity to really undertake them in the timescale that would seem appropriate, that there is that confidence amongst the teams to say that, and maybe have interim measures. It might be the ideal solution, but the teams themselves will have that knowledge about what's going to work and where they can actually effect change that will improve the situation. So I think there is a balance to be struck in this area that's quite healthy.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions then on item 2.3? No. Thank you very much for that report, Graham. And item 3.1 is our next report, and that's from Claire. And it's a series of 3 internal audit reports. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you. The first of our reports is on overtime, and we've given limited assurance on both control design and control effectiveness in this area. The key issue with the overtime process is that the overtime system is approximately 25 to 30 years old. It's based on an out-of-date programming language, requires a full rewrite to address security concerns and functionality limitations. Digital are currently estimating that this will take around 12 to 18 months to replace and cost around £1 million, and are reluctant to do anything to the existing system which isn't fit for purpose in the meantime. So that leaves some control gaps, including claimants can currently choose any approver, which increases the risk of collusion and fraud in the overtime system. Around 21% of the claims weren't being approved by the business support unit, which should be a key control in the process. There's a process in place where the business support unit will process batch approvals, so the scrutiny over individual claims is fairly low. Our data analysis showed that quite a lot of submissions have very vague entries for rationale, making it more difficult to scrutinise the reason for the overtime being necessary. And within the process, payroll aren't able to reject claims that have been poorly processed earlier in the process. So, for example, if they've been approved but it's not the correct rate, or it's like it doesn't have a rationale for it, which should be part of the process, payroll can't send them back or reject them once they've been approved on the overtime system. There's also compliance issues with the process around like really old claims are being submitted and approved and paid. So we found 160 claims that were over 7 months late, but were still paid. We've also flagged within the report issues around incorporating value for money decision making into kind of guidance and providing more training on the process here. But overall, the process is vulnerable to erroneous and fraudulent claims in what's quite a significant expense area. Management have largely accepted our recommendations or suggested suitable alternatives to mitigate the risks, but real improvement will only really come when the system development is there to get controls in this area up to an acceptable standard that closes the control gaps highlighted by the poor system functionality.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. I'm sure there'll be some questions on this report. So open it up for comments, questions. Angela.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Claire, for the report. I've got a couple of questions. I can understand the, not replacing scope if there is a proposal that this would be incorporated into the payroll system, because it just seems more logical that it's an integrated system that manages the totality of reward and remuneration for staff. So I just wanted to clarify, is that the case, and what's the timescale for it? Because it does seem an area that is really critical, that the controls are in place to manage this really effectively. And I also just want to ask about the time frame for submitting claims. Appreciating that obviously this would require consultation with different groups, but is that something that is planned to be done, given again the improvements that we could see and the public assurance that when overtime is being allocated, it is being done for priority reasons. It'll always be for good reasons, but for priority reasons and in the interests of efficiency. Thank you.
Okay, so as soon as the question was asked, Katie put her hand up, so come to you, Katie.
Thank you, Chair. I'll come in on the discussion in relation to scope. So scope is obviously the internal system within Police Scotland that sits independently from the payroll system. So payroll is currently run by iTrent, and there are conversations ongoing about looking at the totality of an ERP system that effectively would bring together your core hierarchy, your payroll, your budget, etc., into one system. And it's a complex piece of work for anybody that's kind of procured and then implemented in ERP, but it's definitely the direction of travel that's being explored by the organisation. But ERPs do not come cheaply. They require significant resource and budgetary investment in order to implement. So that work is underway. But in reality, probably is likely at least a couple of years would be a realistic time frame, I would say. Scope has two small teams, one of which sits in HR actually, and they're predominantly responsible for looking at fault investigations, production of requirements, engagement on requirements, and then full testing, so UAT and technical testing. And then within digital, there's a very small team, I think it's maybe 2 or 3, who are developers who can actually write the script, the coding required for scope. It's a very old code, and it's not one that you would find in the marketplace. And scope is, as we know, was built just for Police Scotland. So it's not one of the well-known, it's not a branded system where you can go and buy that coding. So that there is definitely some risk for the organisation. It's on our risk register. I guess I'm saying at the moment, I was looking at the requirements for scope. We've got a list of 18 currently, functionality developments, of which this overtime is one of them. Others are driven by kind of short-term, relatively simple to do, but needs the capacity. And then others get into more medium, longer term, more complex functionality development, of which this overtime would be one. So I guess I'm saying it's a question of prioritization of capacity and kind of, where we want those developers to focus, their time. Beyond that, as I say, in ERP, there's a full programme of work that's been stood up looking at what that would look like, what the requirements would be, and potentially how we would go to market to procure such a system. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Ewan, you've also got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it's just to cover the point, provide a little bit more context with regards to the timescale within which claims have to be submitted. I think the challenge that we face here is the fact that, as the members will know, police officers do not have contracts of employment, but they are governed by police regulations. So actually, when there is an entitlement to overtime, it's almost an absolute entitlement without timescale, albeit I will say that when claims come in, there is other legislation, the Prescription and Limitations Scotland Act from 1973, which does put a 5-year limit on claims, but obviously 5 years in terms of talking about dealing with claims is not appropriate and absolutely not aspirational. So we have to move into the areas where we can make those, and the phrase has come up, continuous improvements in terms of process and policy, guidance to officers, guidance to line managers, so that corrective advice can be given, and encourage claims to be submitted as soon as possible after the event. But this is all in the face of the challenge of dealing with police regulations at the same time. But I just thought it might be helpful to provide some context on that.
Thank you, Ewan. Yeah, 7 months is bad enough. We don't want claims that are 5 years old. Anyway, Angela, these were responses to your questions. Are you content with that, or?
So I suppose my observation more than anything would be that, I'm not suggesting that we spend £1 million replacing scope. I do wonder, as I was saying at the earlier conversation, are there mitigations that we could put in place that are some way short of that, that don't cost us £1 million, but we're spending 27 million, I think it said in the paper, on an annual basis? It would seem proportionate to do something to tighten up the controls in and around this. And the final point, I do think, notwithstanding the regulations, there are processes and requirements on all line managers to sign off these overtime claims. So again, I would be urging the teams to require or request that officers submit their claims within a reasonable timescale and repeatedly ask them for it. So that it's the only way, because I just wonder, how can you remember what was authorised if it's coming in 7 months after the event? An observation. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Katie, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the comments. So we will look at the technical requirements potentially for this overtime piece and look at that in terms of the prioritisation of scope functionality development. But I think more broadly, with the exception of one recommendation, we have accepted all the others that actually will help with that practice around making sure that kind of what's going into the system is timely, correct, etc. So hopefully that will mitigate risk in that space. I think my experience of other organisations is that sometimes there is a practice of banking overtime, and for example, in the run up to Christmas, etc., so that potentially your pay packet prior to Christmas perhaps has a little bit of banked money in there. So we will definitely focus on that. I think what we've said is that we don't necessarily think training is the requirement, but we do think an awareness and making sure the guidance is fully usable is exactly where we'll focus.
Okay, thank you very much. I think if that covers those questions, Angela, the next hand that went up was from Pauline a wee while ago. So coming to you now, Pauline.
Thanks very much. My question comments were around the value assessment, page 9 or page 16 of 72 of the report, if you're looking at it digitally, is on this topic. And I was wondering, my question is a bit broader about how overtime budgets are set. What are the kind of factors that are kind of taken into account when setting them? And is that what's meant in terms of the response to the recommendation about it will be partly accepted and those factors and considerations will be reviewed? Because I recognise that, you know, when considering whether to authorise overtime, there are factors such as public safety, health and safety, well-being considered. I would also hope things like organisational learning, personal development, cost would be considered. And of course, there is a cut-off point when actually overtime can be cheaper than employing staff and vice versa. So is that guidance all going to be updated going forward?
Thank you, Pauline. Lynn.
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to come in around the budget aspect of it. So we work with the different business areas around the detailed budget build, as you'll be familiar with, as it comes through Resources Committee, etc. So we do look at what's happened previously, what's forthcoming, but it's very difficult because the overtime budget can vary, you know, depending on large events or, you know, like this year we've seen op roll and, you know, things like that. So, you know, there will be an element of that planned overtime, but there will always be a space for reactive, unplanned overtime. And I think that was the key thing for me, particularly around the value for money recommendation that was in there, because it can't always be pre-planned at the best rates, and sometimes it's balancing operational goals, priorities, response against the cost of, you know, of the resource. So but we do accept overall that it needs to get looked at and over you know, in terms of that balancing those two areas. So in terms of the budget work build itself, we work with the Deputy Chief Constables to look at what's came through the budget build and how that can be, you know, allocated out. We currently hold a contingency as part of the budget within overtime for some of those unexpected costs, and that's monitored and released throughout the year. And we've recently stood back up our overtime management group that was in place I think 23-24. So that's really to get into the detail of some of the overtime spend that's coming through, and really to try and distinguish between, you know, the essential and, you know, maybe overtime that's not so essential, but essentially it's all required. So there is a lot of work in that space in terms of those controls at that sort of financial monitoring, budget build point of view, and then essentially how that will feed into the guidance. But the key point for me is just going back to is there will always be a need for both pre-planned and reactive.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. I think DCC Smith wants to come in as well.
I did, Chair. Lynn made the point I was going to make. It was just, I suppose, to reassure you on two counts, really. In terms of overtime spend, we've stood back up the overtime management group, as Lynn said, which DCC Spears will chair. It was really effective, and it enabled us to have a really good grip as to where the overtime was being spent. Divisionally, but also at a team level, not only in terms of money, but well-being. You know, I would have been used to, as a divisional commander, having a top earners effectively, and you were able to then understand who was claiming the overtime and why, and actually was it simply because they liked their overtime and they were happy to do that, or actually have you got concerns around them individually in terms of maybe financial concerns, but also around the hours that they're working, so that you can manage that locally. So we've stood that back up to provide the sort of assurance in relation to that, both financially but also from a wellbeing perspective. And just in terms of systems around this, in terms of the recording, I would absolutely love us to be in the position where we can have an ERP solution, an ecosystem, cradle to grave, kind of golden thread in terms of hire to retire from an individual perspective. At the moment, with Alan as the SRO of ERP, or EPF, lots of acronyms, apologies, but we're trying to work out the balance between what I would call regret spend from updating current systems that we know aren't fit for purpose versus investment in new systems and processes, knowing that we want to invest in an ERP solution further down the line. So anything that we do now has to be right in terms of the decision, so that we are utilising kind of money in the correct and appropriate way, notwithstanding a lot of our systems are exceptionally old, as you will know. So just to reassure you that we are having those discussions, and we're looking at all of our systems, not just overtime recording, not scope, you know, everything much more broadly across our kind of IT landscape, to work out where the best investment is in terms of systems and processes, with an eye to what is coming over the hill, so that we can make wise choices in that area. So just to add to that.
Thank you very much. Pauline, comfortable there with those answers?
Yeah, thanks very much. Really helpful to understand the work that's going on to update and help people in terms of making those decisions, particularly when it's kind of the unplanned type overtime too. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think that particular finding on page 9 in relation to value for money is particularly important for us, with public interest hat on. Public obviously expect us to be able to manage the spend on overtime, but also be able to explain why it was necessary. So I think the recommendation having been accepted or partially accepted by management is helpful in that respect. Taking that forward, that will help us, I think, be able to deal with any questions on this issue. So now, if there are any other questions on this particular report, we can take them now, or we can move on to the next report, which is on environment and sustainability. Okay, we'll do that and move that back to Claire, please.
Okay, so during this work, we found that the existing environmental strategy was setting clear strategic objectives and sustainability targets, integrating information from the existing fleet and estate strategies and reflecting the net zero commitments by 2045. We did, however, find that sustainability training wasn't being provided to senior staff or staff with budget responsibilities, which could result in missed opportunities to implement efficiency measures, sustainable procurement decisions, and waste reduction practices. We also thought there was an opportunity to include more horizon scanning in the annual sustainability report, which goes to the SPA board, which would include things like analysis of performance trends in the wider public sector, overviews of any confirmed or likely changes to Scottish Government legislative requirements, and that would in turn help inform allocation of resources to sustainability initiatives. We looked in detail at the requirements of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009, and we noted that SPA are required to report their carbon emissions within the annual Public Bodies Climate Change Duties report submitted to Sustainable Scotland Network. Carbon emissions are reported by scope, so we found there's like scope 1, 2 and 3, and the scope 1 and 2 reporting was generally mature processes, but we did note some potential underreporting due to refrigerant leak data gaps, and we noted that significant scope 3 gaps persist, including things like completeness of waste stream data, as well as data for purchased goods, services, home working, staff commuting. There were improvements in train to those. For example, the business travel data was being gathered in a more robust way. There's forthcoming government guidance which will make these areas mandatory for reporting, so we've recommended management prioritise closing those gaps. So whilst there was a lot of areas where Police Scotland's emissions data processes had improved and were still improving, and the evidence of a growing organisational maturity and efforts to understand and quantify the gaps, we did note significant gaps still to address. We would say, though, that the gaps that are in place at Police Scotland are broadly in line with reporting trends in the wider Scottish public sector. So it's not out of step with other organisations in terms of what they are and aren't able to get robust data on. But overall, we've concluded that we can provide limited assurance on the design of the internal controls due to the reporting gaps identified, and moderate assurance over the operational effectiveness of the controls in place based on the robustness of the strategy and the satisfactory reporting processes for the majority of the scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Any questions on this one? If there are no questions, maybe I could just ask about the assurances we can take from this that environment and sustainability is being given appropriate prioritisation. We do have targets to meet, so I think if the report is clarifying that, that'd be helpful. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank BDO for the report, and particularly Tom O'Hara and Ben Fahey, who took us through the audit. They were really helpful, and it was actually a really productive process. I think just to reassure you, the findings of the report are definitely in keeping with the trends in the Scottish public sector. I think if we are part of the steering group for the Sustainable Scotland Network, and in discussing these sorts of issues, we can see across the Scottish public sector with our counterparts in local authorities and blue light services that we are in no way out of step, particularly in relation to supply chain emissions, which is only now emerging as a particular issue across the public sector. It's not been something that we have been required to report on before, and actually it would have been very difficult prior to a couple of years ago, simply because the software and the AI technology to assess these in any reasonable timescale just didn't exist, and it does now. So we're looking at 2 or 3 organisations that might be able to provide us with that software. I think everything else in relation to scope 3 we know of, and we have emissions reporting. However, we are just not there yet with understanding all of the information. And if you have a look, waste is a perfect example. 10 years ago, our report had 4 line entries in relation to waste, and I just went and checked our climate change report for last year, and it had 16 entries. So we are beginning to see a granularity of reporting. So it's just to say that obviously the materiality of scope 3 emissions means that it is not as immediately important to attack mitigation in relation to those emissions. It's important to understand it because we know, in terms of that horizon scanning that Claire is talking about, that we are going to have to respond to net zero frameworks and work that the Scottish Government will set for us in terms of sequestration of carbon. But really, in reality, the emissions that we still are dealing with are Scope 1 and 2, those emissions related to gas and electricity, because those are our material emissions and we should be reducing them. I think with Scope 3, it's about understanding where they come from and understanding what we will do collectively as a public sector to address them in the future.
Thank you very much, Jen. That's really helpful. Paul, you had your hand up.
I'm not, I mean, it's a full answer, but I'm not sure it's the straight yes or no that you were kind of looking for, Chair. Is it yes, we're taking it seriously, or no, we're not taking it seriously, but we're no worse than anyone else in the public sector?
I would say yes, we are taking it seriously. For example, in relation to waste, we are talking to OCS, our soft FM provider, in order to improve their Power BI portal so that we can understand more about the individual waste streams. In relation to supply chain, we are talking to Greenlake, Green Insight and CO2A about the software packages they could possibly provide for us in relation to supply chain emissions. We have already calculated our well-to-tank emissions, and they will be added into our baseline for sustainability strategy. And then in relation to home working and staff mileage, you will see that we have partially accepted those findings, and that's because we are not entirely sure whether they will be included as part of the Scottish Government guidance. And actually, I'm taking that very seriously, because we cannot validate those emissions in any way, shape or form, because they will come from staff. So in order to make sure that the emissions that we do report are validated and auditable, we actually do have a bit of a discussion to have with the Scottish Government about whether we should be including those, because we cannot account or reduce those emissions. And then in relation to business warrants, we are in contact with Police Scotland admin team to make sure that we gather that information. So work is already underway. So yes, we are taking it very seriously.
Great, thanks for that. I am assured, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, anything else on this report? If not, the third audit we have is on complaints management. Back to you, Claire.
Okay, so the complaints management work is quite a detailed piece of advisory work. Sorry. Bear with me a second, my computer's downloading an update and making everything lag. So the internal audit review here identified quite a few opportunities for enhancing complaints handling procedures. We're aware that there is a significant backlog in handling complaints, and we feel the primary factors contributing to that are issues like inconsistent complaint categorisation and triage, reliance on extensive manual processes, duplication of effort, which in part is due to quite tight system access controls. So people are having to give information to one person who has access to the system who then rekeys it. There's also inconsistencies in complaint form completion. So a lot of the sample of complaints that we worked through, there was significant unnecessary rework and follow-up activity because, forms just hadn't been completed thoroughly enough the first time. We also saw that a lot of complaints were not being investigated or concluded within the timelines prescribed by statutory guidance, and there was approximately 1,600 complaints in backlog in the system that were late. We have recommended, there's a lot of detailed recommendations in this report, so I will not go through them all in detail, but essentially we're recommending a more risk-based approach to complaint categorisation, which would help to improve the speed and consistency of how they're triaged. Longer term, we think incorporating AI and automation would reduce the time spent on the administrative tasks related to the complaints process and decrease double keying. We think some immediate things could be done to help improve the process and speed it up a bit. So short term, just granting system access to inspectors and complaint staff would eliminate unnecessary lead times and free up some resources to focus more on the actual investigation rather than the administration. We've also recommended establishing more clear and consistent criteria for categorisation and triage, because we did identify very similar complaints that were classified differently. So there's room for improvement there too. There's already been steps taken to address this backlog, deploying different teams aligned to different priorities and creating a task force of investigators to bolster capacity. So there is a lot going on already, but there's additional opportunities to enhance the system and to update the operating procedure to give staff better guidance and strengthen training, improve communication channels with complainants to increase transparency and satisfaction, and to develop more robust organisational learning around the complaints process to address the root causes of complaints. We also recognise that continued collaboration and engagement with SPA and the PIRC will help to align guidance on complaints handling with policing needs and ensure unsuitable complaints are filtered and that valid concerns get prompt and thorough attention at an earlier stage. We think that there's a lot of opportunity here to refine procedures, and some of those opportunities are quite quick and easy things that can immediately improve. Some of them are longer term, looking at more automation, better system solutions to enable faster resolution. But yeah, there's quite a lot of findings in here, so I'm happy to take any questions on any of them.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, before I open it up, just to clarify that to avoid duplication, we won't be actually taking this report as it stands to the Complaints and Conduct Committee, but the committee will be given access to the report and will be made aware of its findings. And we do have the benefit of having the chair of that committee as a member of ARAC. So Katharina will be ensuring that the committee is well informed on this matter without having the duplication of taking the report to both committees. Anyway, so open it up for any comments or questions. Paul.
Yeah, it is quite concerning that, you know, there's a lot of resource being thrown at this, and it was a contentious issue, and that's the reason why Operation Glade was set up. And in spite of the resource being spent, it's only a 5% reduction, which in a year, which basically is going to take 20 years to get the backlog addressed. And that is quite worrying. And I'm also looking at the 180 days, 180.5 is the average number of complaints completed a week. So I calculate that there's like a 9-week backlog in terms of timing. So it's just what can Police Scotland tell me to assure me that that this is going to get better sometime soon?
Okay, who wants to respond to that? Helen.
I have just noticed that the ACC has also put her hand up, so I will let the ACC go first, and then I'm very happy to come in.
Lynn.
Helen, thank you. That's very gracious of you, and thank you, Chair. Paul, thank you for the question. And Chair, as you've rightly referenced, we've discussed this not unreasonably at length at Complaints and Conduct Committee, and I've no doubt that we'll continue to do so. If I may, just a couple of points on the report. So firstly, we are very grateful to BDO for taking on the review, because as the report highlights, it wasn't part of the proposed schedule. We asked for it to be done in an effort to sort of improve our performance in this area. So we're grateful for that. However, I'd hoped, if I'm honest, and this is maybe a gap between the remit of the review and my own expectations around it, I'd hoped that it would go a bit further than it did. And indeed, I've written to Benjamin to outline that, because Helen will come in, I've no doubt, on the specifics, but the vast majority of the recommendations were already pointing to work that we had already started and that we had in train. So something that went beyond that would have been useful. But as I say, we're really grateful for the report, and there's very little in there with which I would disagree. I would just say that, you know, we don't work unilaterally. We've made reference to the SP and PIRC. We have to work within the guidance and the framework that is set to them. And indeed, a piece of work that we have got ongoing is around reviewing that guidance, which PIRC have indicated a willingness to do. And I think that is a really key factor for us, because what we're very keen to get to is what we perceive to be a proportionate investigation and a proportionate letter of response to complainers, which is actually focused on the complainer's need and requirement, rather than a somewhat, I would argue, archaic process. In response to your question, Paul, as you know, there's a huge amount of work ongoing. there are some developments that we've made over the course of the last couple of weeks, which obviously don't feature in this report. It's out with the scope of the remit of it, and also perhaps this committee as well. But I'm sure that we can go through those complaints and conduct. But please be assured, it's continually a focus for us. We are looking at every means possible to try and consistently drive the backlog down. There is no question that resources are a challenge for us. The Chief Constable hasn't shied away from that in terms of the collective challenge that is for us. And also we've been through a period of increased demand with slight resource decline because a number of the operations that we've had ongoing. So please be assured that it remains a very sharp focus for us. And Helen, I think you probably want to come in on some of the specifics that we've chatted through and we've put into place over the course of the last couple of months, if I may bring you in that point with your permission, Chair. Thanks.
Yes, of course, Helen.
Thank you very much, ACC and Chair. I would just kind of endorse the points that the ACC has made in relation to that, and keen to give the reassurance. I think the timing of this has been really, really good for us in relation to actually reinforcing some of the areas of work that have been progressing under the Operation Glades oversight in relation to the work that's been happening there, and helping to reinforce some of that work, but also stretch our thinking and our approaches a bit further in relation to that. So, for example, our SOP is under review at the moment, and the categorisation that we developed over the Operation Glade work is giving us an opportunity to really review that and see is that working, or how do we need to continue to develop that. So the timing is good, along with the fact that our Centurion upgrade is due to take place later this month, which is going to again be a critical point for us in relation to some of the process and the system that goes into our complaints. So that's been a huge piece of work that's been ongoing, and I think again some of the work that we can then do with digital division around some of the findings within this report will then be able to follow through. And one of the other real values of the BDO work has been the process mapping and the value that some of those discussions and work with the BDO team, if they've engaged with my team in relation to that, and has given us again some things that we'll be able to take forward. So I know we've got complaints and conduct tomorrow in relation to the committee, and what I'm really keen to do is to we obviously to discuss at that point further, but then also bring back a more detailed action plan on these findings, and then also the other Operation Glade work that's been ongoing in relation to that. And I know we'll be able to discuss that more tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Helen. It seems appropriate now to bring the convener of complaints and conduct in.
No, sorry, Chair, can I just ask a supplementary question?
Sorry, Paul. Yes, of course.
So when can we expect that 5% to increase to something more acceptable, and how much would that be? Say in a year's time, what would be expecting to see in a year's time?
If I can come in relation to that, I think we have to look at this in its sort of the totality in terms of all of the elements within it. What we have seen more recently is obviously huge growth in terms of our volume of complaints that are being concluded. And again, we'll be able to provide more detail around that tomorrow. So I do hope that moving forward, we are in a position where we have had that additionality in terms of the resource. And I know we'll again talk tomorrow in the action plan in relation to actually kind of what that looks like moving forward in terms of that. But I do feel we have hit a point where there's a number of different factors coming in. We are obviously talking to PERC around our SOP, and then obviously also the statutory guidance and the timescale in relation to that. So I do hope we're going to see that. What we've really seen over the last while is that levelling off. I think if we hadn't done all of that work, that unallocated queue would continue to have grown as we had seen throughout 2024. We have seen that level off. We are now completing a lot more complaints through that. We've got the closer performance management in relation to it. So it's really, really hard to predict because I can't say exactly what the expected volume coming in is going to be. We have seen a drop off in volume over the last little while as well, which is again another positive. So I hope with all of these factors coming together and, you know, all these factors coming together, we will see that continued improvement. Now it's levelled off, coming back down. I can't give you exact timescales, but I give you the absolute commitment that we continue to work hard at making sure that we can enhance our complaint handling process and bring that unallocated queue down.
And back to the ACC.
Chair, thank you. It's just really, I suppose, to echo Helen's point, it is very, very difficult, and I do completely understand the desire to get some sort of metrics around it. However, as I touched on, we've had a significant number of operations over the course of the summer, which impact on resourcing. We are also, and we're fully behind the commitment to support frontline policing through the force mobilisation model, but that again has an impact on resources within professional standards and our ability to process complaints. And then finally, all it can take, and I know we've touched on this at Complaints and Conduct, is a single event such as a protest, for example, and that really causes a sharp spike in the volume that comes in that has to be worked through. So it's by no means an exact science, and I know that that's not the expectation of the committee, but to get any real firm, to provide you with firm figures that have any sort of worked out calculations behind them, I feel that would be misleading, and I don't want to do that because it's inordinately difficult to do. But I echo Helen's commitment around it.
Thank you, Lynn. Paul, can I come back to you with apologies
No,
for not having done that previously?
No, it's okay. I'm done. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Katharina, then.
Chair, maybe if I let the other committee members come in first with the questions, and then I mop up whatever kind of might be left at the end.
Okay, Pauline, then. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the report and for the responses to the questions that thus far. As we've said, a huge amount in it, and I welcome that it's been requested and that's going to be helpful in terms of trying to understand what more can be done in terms of kind of processes and procedures to make sure that the complaints are as well handled as they can be going forward. I guess I'm still unsure as to whether this will be enough, these recommendations will be enough, and I accept what you said, Helen, that there are other things that you're doing too that will actually address the backlog as well. And with that automation, will that kind of help in terms of that ask for additional resources given the financial challenges that are being felt at the moment? And I guess part of the reason for my question around that is I'm not quite sure to what extent there's a complete understanding of the reason for the increase in complaints, because the report talks about a 97% increase in complaints. And if we understand the nature of those and how we might address them, that helps us then going forward in terms of what we might need to do in terms of a sustainable solution.
Anyone wish to respond to that? Helen.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions and the points that you raise. It's been quite, I think, a journey in relation to, unfortunately, where we got to the situation that we got to with the unallocated queue in respect of that, which, if I go back as far as 2021, was then a restructuring at that point in relation to all the complaints coming into the professional standards department in terms of us then progressing those. And then throughout that time, what we had then seen is that unallocated queue kind of continuing to develop around that, and we saw specific spikes in 23-24 in terms of the volume of complaints as well, which clearly kind of it really did spike and then add to that unallocated queue. So I guess I just give the reassurance that across the Operation Glade work, whilst we'll take into account the findings within this audit, we continue to do the wider work that we need to do within the organisation. There's a key part to me about making sure the visibility of complaint matters is still there across divisions, so that officers and staff are aware of the reasonings behind these matters. We do a publication called The Standard. The last one focused on one of our higher volumes of matters, which was irregularity in procedure, and encouraging officers and staff to understand how these complaints are then generated, to kind of come back to your point there about actually how do we prevent the causes in relation to this and actually do that wider bit of work. So that work is continuing under the OpGlade, reporting into the Complaints and Conduct Committee in respect of that. And as I say, some of this work within this audit around some of our process can then help us try and influence and drive some of that as well. I hope that answers your question. It's a really sort of complex picture, I think, in relation to where we got to in this position, but what we are seeing is that steadying off and also the reduction in relation to that unallocated queue from earlier in this year.
Thanks, Helen. I'm not quite sure still as to why we've seen such an increase in the volume of complaints that the report mentions over the last year.
So we have dropped off in relation to the first 2 quarters of this year. We're seeing it come back down more in line with kind of 2021, 2022 levels in respect of that. But there were there was spikes across all of the categories. There was no one single reason for that that increase in complaints that we saw in 23-24. And obviously we continue to monitor and track the trends and identify if there is any prevention work that we can do.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think just following on from Paul's question, what I'm hearing is that at tomorrow's or future complaints and conduct committees, the recommendations from this audit will be incorporated into a wider improvement plan with some key milestones, which should then be translated into some trajectories as to when we might see performance improving and the backlog being cleared.
Yes, very much. And that's something that I'm keen to prepare. Obviously, we'll discuss it tomorrow at the committee. Just due to timings, we haven't been able to bring that in its full tomorrow, and then we will bring that at the next committee.
Thanks very much for clarifying. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. Katharina.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that. So thank you to BDO for the report. Really useful and good to hear the responses to the report as well from Police Scotland in terms of acknowledging the value of this work. I mean, from an audit and risk perspective, I suppose colleagues have just probed, and I think we've just heard assurances around there will be improvement actions, and we will see the detail of that. And what we will take in more detail, I suppose, into the complaints and conduct space is kind of that more, what is the bigger picture? Because actually, you know, if I look at this, what the report has actually given me is it's given me a better understanding, I think, of maybe some of the reasons to a degree for why we are where we are. And my kind of reflection on this, and I will come to a couple of questions, I suppose, or probably maybe just comments in terms of, you know, because I would really like to take this conversation into the complaints and conduct space. Again, mindful of that, we don't want to duplicate the effort between the committees. But I think this is, to my knowledge, is the first kind of assessment of this type of this operational efficiency, I suppose, since the move to a new national model. And there is quite a few things here that were actually of a surprise to me, particularly when it comes to complaint form completion, comms, etc., because, you know, those are all the types of things that I would have expected the move to a national complaints handling model to actually avoid, you know, because you're creating a centre of excellence. So you would have expected, or certainly I would have expected, the standards to kind of have increased in that space. Other kind of things that jump out at me is just how strong the organisation possibly is from a systems perspective. So again, Helen, you touched on this. I mean, the upgrades to the system are quite, you know, I think they will be quite fundamental. If I take it up a level, you know, looking at this audit from a strategic perspective, the reality is Police Scotland will always be facing complaints, you know, and those complaints they may dip, they may go up. You know, we just heard that there's various external factors that impact on that. There is a degree to which the organisation can mitigate that, but it's limited. So complaints will always be something that will always happen. And the more efficient the organisation becomes at managing those complaints, you know, both from a complainer perspective, because everybody who complains wants to have an earlier resolution as a completer resolution, but also, you know, from a operational resources type perspective, the more efficient the organisation becomes, the more public money can be spent on other matters that are incredibly important in policing. So those things need to be addressed, and I think this audit certainly gives us a really good starting point to maybe start delving a little bit more into this in the Complaints and Conduct Committee, to just really understand what the organisation will be doing from an operational efficiency perspective in the space. So this needs to happen, but I would quite like to see a bit of a, you know, what again colleagues have asked for, a very, very clear trajectory of when certain things will land and what the expected outcome of that will be on the efficiency of the process. And we can go into more detail at that at the committee either tomorrow or the subsequent committee, but we absolutely need to understand what will be happening when because looking at the actions here, conscious, again, we have spent quite a lot of time looking at this, and there's a lot of actions, and there's a lot of recommendations, and there's a lot of management responses. It is not entirely clear to me that, once all of this has been implemented, and, bearing in mind that a lot of them are into 2027, what level of extra efficiency and capacity is this going to give us? Is this going to be sufficient? I think that goes into exactly the questions that Paul and Pauline have already asked. So we really need to get on top of this, because actually this is quite fundamental. There's a lot of extra resource which has been pumped into this area over the last 12 months. So I know everybody acknowledges this, but I think we're kind of done just staring at the problem and admiring the problem. I think we now really need to get into, if there is solutions, when are we going to see those solutions land? What are the dependencies? What's the cost? And what is it going to give us in terms of increased efficiency, which again should take the backlog down in time, and at a faster pace than the 5% per annum at the moment, which is the trajectory looks like. So apologies, I've kind of ranted a little bit. As you can tell, I'm very, very keen to kind of get that shifted into the remit of the other committee, not because that as ARC we can't, as ARC we've got a very specific remit. The substantive issues, I think, I can give you absolute assurance, we will be looking at this through the Complaints and Conduct Committee lens. Thank you for your forbearance, Chair, for this monologue.
Thank you very much, Katharina. I think we're very happy to leave that in your hands in respect of the detail of it. But we are obviously, as a committee, we've all expressed some concerns about the backlog and the time it might take to deal with it. And pleased to hear about additional resources. But the question is, are they sufficient? Are the additional resources sufficient? And will there be sufficient priority given to this work, because it is important for those making complaints, but also for those against whom complaints have been made. So we're happy to leave that with you, Katharina, and we'll keep an eye on this from our point of view as well. But thank you to everybody who's contributed to that discussion. Lynn, I've just noticed your hand was up. Sorry, I missed that.
Not at all, Chair, and I'm completely, I'm very much attuned to time and the propriety of discussing this further elsewhere. But in terms of the point that Katharina's made around setting out the interdependencies, that is a piece of work that we have been doing to try and unpick and understand where some of our bottlenecks are. I am more than happy, and indeed I think it's an imperative for us that we include that in the action plan. And a bit, if I might jump back to Donna's update, earlier on, I think that this committee found it very helpful to get that context around what the art of the possible is unilaterally, and then the art of the possible that is dependent on other factors that are not within the control of, for example, the complaints or professional standards department. So more than happy to set that out in the action plan as we go forward. And I think that there's a recognition, and Helen will correct me, but perhaps not today, just given the confines of time. There's no doubt that resource is a challenge, but I think that we have to be realistic within Police Scotland and within PSD, and I think we are, in terms of what we can reasonably expect right now in terms of uplifted resource, and understand that unless we unpick and actually re-engineer some of our processes and practices, and also those that are linked to other organisations who have considerable influence in this, then we will constantly be in a vicious cycle of incoming and having to up resource. So whilst I would not be looking any resource gift horse in the mouth, I think that if we look at the root cause here and we start to address something that, or start to bring forward sustainable solutions, I think it needs to be around process and practice as opposed to resource numbers, if that ramble makes sense.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Katharina, did you want to come back in?
Thank you, Chair. No, it was a legacy hand, but I absolutely agree with Helen. I think exactly it's exactly this: is the extra resource will not actually do anything unless some of the structural things, which I think this audit has done a really good job of actually highlighting. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to kind of delving a bit more into this, because again, I'm conscious some of the recommendations look quite ambitious from an organizational perspective, AI, etc., etc. So you know, really keen. I know that this is where the conversation needs to head to, but it's you know, I'm really keen to understand how robust is this, because I absolutely agree with Lynn. Unless the structural issues are fixed, you will have to keep throwing more resource at it without really any noticeable impact. So yeah, so I welcome this. It does feel like for the first time, I'm certainly seeing information here that gives us an opportunity at the Complaints and Conduct Committee to really start understanding in more level of detail what the organization is going to do and when, exactly around that structural element, rather than just, you know, keep throwing resource at it, which so far, you know, despite best efforts, you know, it has stemmed, I hear what you're saying, Helen, it has stemmed that increase, but it hasn't necessarily helped us yet to reverse the trend. And I think that's where we need to get to.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think it's clear that this report, as well as the other two audit reports, have been welcomed, and the work is appreciated. I think we should be able to use the findings of these audits to improve matters, and that's always very helpful. So thank you for those reports, Claire. Could I just ask you one question before we move on, and that is that we were due to have a report on the audit of change at this meeting, but it's not here today. So I'm just wondering, I think it's now planned to come to February, but I wondered if you wanted to say something about why that has been delayed.
So the change audit is currently in the reporting stage, so I believe a draft is with management. I can double check when that was sent, but yeah, it's not quite finalised, but it's almost there.
Sounds like it'll definitely be available for us for our next meeting. So thank you for that. And thank you for all of the other reports. Thank you. If we're finished with item 3.1, item 3.2 is an update report from our external auditors. And I think we have Hannah McKellar from Grant Thornton with us.
Morning, and thanks, Chair.
Good morning, Hannah.
In terms of an external audit update, given the time of year, there's probably no significant updates from our end. So following the board meeting on the 25th of September, a modified opinion was signed for the 24-25 annual report and accounts, which completed last year's audit cycle. Audit Scotland have issued their planning guidance for 25-26, and there's no significant changes or updates within that guidance, which we anticipate to have any impact on our audit for next year. We've been working with the finance team to agree planning timescales for the 25-26 external audit in order to get a plan to Audit Risk and Assurance Committee in February. So very brief external audit update, but given where we are in terms of the year, all on track for plan in February.
That's helpful, thank you. Any questions for Hannah? If not, thank you very much for coming along, Hannah, and giving us that brief update. Our last item in the public part of the meeting is the committee work plan at item 4.1. And I think this is quite familiar to everybody now. I'm not sure if there's perhaps a small misprint on the first line, if you like, of the report, where it says, I think that the date of the audit committee in February is the 6th of February. I think it might actually be the 12th, but we can confirm that and you make sure that that's corrected if necessary. Otherwise, any comments or questions on the work plan? Nope. Thank you very much. We're moving now then to consider the items that we're taking in private, items 5 to 8. But I suggest we have a 10-minute comfort break if that's okay with everybody. So it is now 11:38. If we can be back for 11:45, slightly less than 10 minutes. Okay. See you then. Thank you.